Hi, Room 5. Time for Wonderland. Our next chapter is called Rose. Rose sat on Grace's window seat, feeling bad. Mr. Tuffy had scolded her for going to Wonderland. He'd never scolded her before. Of course, she'd never done anything like that, like going to Wonderland before. Riding a bike across the highway that she wasn't even allowed to go near. And going inside the racetrack where her Uncle AJ went, making her mother so aggrieved with him. She had hoped maybe Mr. Duffy would think she was brave or adventurous like Mavis. But instead, he had said she'd given Trouble a chair to sit on. Rose lay down on the window seat and rested her head on the heart-shaped pillow that Grace had made in home economics class in high school. It still had the faint scent of the lavender talcum powder Grace loved so much. Rose wished Mr. Duffy wouldn't talk about being an old geezer, and that he wouldn't say his heart was a thumping gizzard. She wished Mavis's plan had worked, that Mr. Duffy would adopt Henry and be happy again, and not fall asleep in the gatehouse or let magazine salespeople into Magnolia Estates. But Mavis's plan hadn't worked. Rose hoped more than anything that Mavis really was good at coming up with a plan B. Mavis. Rose said there's going to be a mother-daughter book club and you and I can be in it, Mavis said. Her mother didn't answer. She didn't even open her eyes. She sat in the chair in the corner of the apartment, with her feet up on the end of the bed and her head on a pillow. Mama, Mavis said. No answer. Mama! Mavis yelled. Her mother opened her eyes. Seriously, May? She said. Seriously? She lifted her feet with a grunt and dropped them to the floor like they were sacks of rocks. She then leaned forward with her hands on her knees and said, You're kidding. Me, right? No, Mavis said. I'm not kidding. A mother-daughter book club? Mavis nodded. Her mother dropped back in the chair and shook her head. Mavis, she said, mother and daughter book clubs are for mothers and daughters who eat cold soup and use dang silver spoons for their salt instead of a salt shaker like the rest of the world. Mother-daughter book clubs are for mothers who need clean sheets every other day and daughters who belong to junior gardening clubs. She leaned forward again, jabbed a finger into Mavis's direction. Mother-daughter book clubs are not for you and me. Mavis felt anger working its way up from the bottom of her feet to the top of her head. Why do you have to be so mad about everything every minute of the day? She hollered. Every time we move somewhere new, you say you're going to like it better, but you never do. You just have something new to gripe about. Mavis stalked to the door. Well, I like it here, and Rose is my best friend, she said, yanking the screen door open and stepping out onto the little porch. And she does not belong to the junior gardening club, she yelled through the door before stomping down the steps. Maybe her mother thought they weren't good enough for the stupid book club, but Rose didn't think so because she had invited her. Mavis had a bad feeling about her mother and Mrs. Tully. It seemed like all they did was argue. It seemed like Mrs. Tully thought her mother did everything wrong. And it seemed like all her mother ever did was complain about Mrs. Tully. Mavis got Rose's skateboard out of the garage and went around front to the driveway. She wasn't allowed to ride the skateboard on the driveway anymore. Mrs. Tully didn't like it. But the Tullys went home. They were going to some fancy restaurant over in Mobile. Rose had told her it would be boring and she wished she could stay home with Mavis. Really? Mavis had said. Rose had looked surprised and said a very un-Rose-like thing. Well, duh, she had said, holding out her palm so they could do their special handshake, snapping and fist pumping. Now Mavis rode the skateboard up and down the driveway thinking she felt more determined than ever to fix things for Mr. Duffy. She had promised Rose that she would come up with a plan B, but so far she hadn't. How could she convince Mr. Duffy that he needed a dog and Henry needed a home. She had been so certain she could do it, but now it seemed harder than she thought it would be. Maybe Mr. Duffy's heart really was a thumping gizzard after all. Henry. When Henry got out of the fenced yard, he'd run as far away from Wonderland as he can get. He'd run up dirt roads and through fields. He darted across a busy highway and raced through a trailer park. He hurried across the parking lots and dashed into some woods behind a shopping centre. Then he had trotted deeper and deeper into the woods, jumping over moss-covered logs and clusters of bramble bushes and wild strawberries. Squirrels scurried out of his way, and birds fluttered wildly out of the trees as he passed. When he was far enough into the woods, he stopped, panting. Then he slept, a long, deep sleep. For 2 more days, Henry ran along roads and darted amongst trees. He crossed fields, jumped across gullies. He followed paths and wandered along the side of the narrow, twisted lanes. He ate berries and bugs and even a tiny frog. Once he'd been lucky enough to find a discarded bag on the side of the road with half a cheese sandwich and an apple core. He'd even turned over a garbage can here and there, gobbling up mouldy bread, some fried chicken skin, and a few pieces of donuts. He licked tuna clinging to the sides of a slightly rusted can and gnawed on some mouldy pork. But when he had come upon a narrow creek winding through the woods, he drank and drank and drank, the cool water tasting finer than he'd ever had before. Now he laid under the trees, where the ground was soft with pine needles and rotting leaves, and fell asleep. He slept until the hooting of an owl and the croaking of the frogs woke him up. It was dark, the darkest dark that Henry had ever known. Every now and then, fireflies twinkled in the distance. Henry felt lonely, scared and hungry. Maybe he'd made a mistake. Maybe he should go back to Wonderland. Mavis. Rose and Mavis sat on the log in the vacant lot, talking about Plan B. Well, actually, it was Rose who was trying to talk about Plan B. So, she said, what's Plan B? I'm not sure yet, Mavis said, but I thought you were good at coming up with a Plan B. I am. Oh. Rose wiped red dirt off her shorts. I just thought you would have come up with it by now. It takes time to think up a good Plan B. Mavis was starting to feel a little annoyed. Then Rose didn't say anything, and Mavis started to feel a lot annoyed. Maybe you can come up with a Plan B, she said. I'm the only one that's been doing all the thinking. But I'm not the one who said I'm good at coming up with Plan Bs, Rose said. Well, didn't that beat all? Here and Mavis had been trying hard to fix things for Rose and Mr. Duffy. I've been trying to be a good best friend, she said, kicking at the cluster of Queen Anne's lace beside the log. If you'd rather have a different best friend, go ahead. Maybe one of those girls from the swim team, and you could all be in the mother-daughter book club together. Then Mavis sat there in a steamy silence with her arms crossed and her lips clamped tight. A dragonfly flitted amongst the wildflowers in front of them. Mavis kicked at the flowers, making the dragonfly dart away and disappear across the vacant lot. Finally, Rose broke the silence. I wouldn't rather have a different best friend, she said. Mavis kept her arms crossed and her lips clamped tight. Silence. 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 Then Rose said, Aren't you worried about Mr. Duffy? Mavis shrugged. Guess. What do you mean? I mean, yes, I'm worried about him because I know you're worried about him. And then, quite unexpectedly, that old snake, Mr. Jealousy, showed up and made Mavis say, All you and Mr. Duffy care about is each other. What about me? Doesn't anybody care about me? Uh-oh. Mavis hadn't meant to say that, but it was too late. Rose's face turned a little red, and she said, Why are you being so mean? Then the next thing you know, Rose and Mavis were arguing. Mavis reminded Rose that she was the one coming up with the ideas to fix things with Mr. Duffy. Rose pointed out that she had broken every rule in the Tully rule book to go along with all of Mavis's crazy ideas. Mavis and Rose should be glad to have such fun. Glad to have such a fun thing to do as going to Wonderland. Rose said she thought maybe they were being too hasty trying to get a doll for Mr. Duffy, especially when he didn't even want one. On and on, back and forth, until finally Mavis stood up and said, "Fine!" Rose stayed sitting on the log and said, "Fine!" And that was that.